3, 2, 1.
Hey, what is going on, Metaverse Church podcast community? So glad to be hanging out with you again this week. This week, again, is just me coming at you with just what I guess would be a fun, special offshoot episode. But last week, we did an episode with Jeff Reed, who was our first guest to the podcast. And we were talking about like the Metaverse Learning communities that are going to be taking place and whatnot. And again, let me encourage you, if you are a church leader or an individual that is interested in hopping into the metaverse and learning more about that, just head over to leadnet.org/MLC. Kind of see what it is that we're going to be doing in those learning communities. If you're interested in signing up for it, when you do sign up for that, be sure to use the code Stunami, my VR username, STUNAMI. That'll get you a discount to being a part of that learning community. But what I wanted to come in and talk about with you on this episode is really something that got kind of dropped into last week's episode, but not really a lot of highlighted information that was given to it. But I thought that this would be a great opportunity and a great time to kind of put a little bit more of an emphasis on what we're doing at Lakeland VR, and just kind of present it to all of you as listeners, church leaders, metaverse, pioneers, if you will, that if this is something that catches your interest, I would love to have a further conversation with you about that. So just a little bit of a backstory on myself. So back in like 2016, my wife and I, we went through a church planning assessment. And when we went and did that, basically the church planning assessment, what they do is they take you through, a whole bunch of different exercises. They ask you to do stuff like preaching and, ministry philosophies and all that kind of stuff. But our assessment, like everybody who was a part of this assessment during that week, we're given a task to work collectively on the goal of not only just focusing on planting one church, but developing a system that would plant 100 churches in 10 years. Now, if I were to be completely honest with you, by the time that was presented to us, my mind completely shifted off of the idea of planting a single individual church to the idea of like, man, it would be cool to be a church plant that plants churches. Now, obviously, I've never planted a church per se, but I think one thing that my wife and I picked up on as we went through like our cohort learning communities and all that kind of stuff was that dream to plant churches really flourished, and it was a seed that got planted deep down. And at one point in time, my wife and I just kind of said, look, I don't know that church planting is in the cards for us right now. But I think church planting is in the future. And I even said, and I don't know that that's necessarily us planting a church, but it's more of us planting churches. Now, as time went on, I got back into doing ministry, doing next gen ministry, youth ministry, young adults, small groups, and ultimately now doing metaverse ministry with Lakeland VR as, part of Lakeland Community Church in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. But you guys have heard on this episode, I got the opportunity, thanks to Jeff Reed, to be at Exponential Conference back in March in Orlando. And Exponential is a great conference that really focuses on the idea of like church multiplication, which is a huge heartbeat of mine, as you're hearing. And for the first time in over like 8 years at this point, I guess, as we're sitting in this conference environment and I'm watching pastors and individuals, couples get prayed over as they are about to venture out into this year, into this next chapter of their life as church planters and multi-site campus pastors and whatnot. That idea of 100 churches in 10 years popped back up into my brain, something that I hadn't really put a lot of thought towards in quite a while. And that's where this idea of a VR church planning network kind of got birthed. was that idea of something that I learned about over 8 years ago, and a mix to what it is that I'm currently doing this season in the ministry that God has placed me in. And I can't help but feel that maybe for such a time as this is the reason why God introduced me to that idea of a vision of 110 with what we're doing in the metaverse. Like, as many of you know, as you've been listening to this podcast, even if you're new or you're a seasoned vet when it comes to the metaverse ministry, like what most of us either have learned through this podcast or what you already know as a person who's been in these spaces is that the idea of multiplication is really a lot simpler in the metaverse than it is maybe in physical spaces. And this is what I mean. Like, if you were to be a church planner, a physical church planner, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to get equipment, in order to rent a space, in order to get the ministry up off the ground. Now, granted, you could do that for a lot cheaper. House church, micro campuses, all that kind of stuff, for sure, you can do it cheaper. But the typical traditional style of a church plant is hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to get this organization up off the ground and getting into its weekly rhythms of discipling, making disciples, and doing all that great stuff that a church plant does. In fact, I love church planting because usually you got these catalytic leaders that are just so gung-ho about reaching a community that they'll stop at nothing in order to make that happen. But in the metaverse, I believe that can be done faster, and it can be done easier than it can in real life. And now, if I were to point back to the numbers that we've talked about in previous episodes, the idea that there are, at this point, close to 200 million people within the metaverse, man, we've got an entire community that is in need for churches, with only a handful of ministries, Christ-centered ministries that are planted into the metaverse at this point. So this burden that I have been given, I believe, is the idea of like, man, if really anybody who has a heart for reaching the lost could plant a church in virtual reality and lead a ministry the way that God has called them to lead it, then why wouldn't we do that? If it is really so simple as saying, hey, there's a network of churches around you, a network of pastors around you to rally around, pray for you, to be a support system, because it's so easy just to hop in and get something going, why wouldn't we do that? So that's exactly what we're doing over at Lakeland VR. Is we are launching a VR church planting network. Now, this is I believe a small, humble beginning, because I believe ultimately what we could accomplish is like a metaverse ministry or a metaverse church planting network, where we're looking at all the different facets of opportunities in order to build communities of Christ-centered movements that are just reaching the lost in all these different platforms. I believe that's eventually where we're going, but we want to start with what we know and where we're at. And for us, that's the VR church planting. So if I were to give you a quick 30,000 foot perspective of what we're doing, is we're providing an opportunity for you, if you are an individual who is interested in leading a church in virtual reality, or maybe you are a senior pastor or some church leader in a physical church establishment right now. We are wanting to provide you an opportunity to be a part of a 3-month training process, that what you'll get in that is training. You'll get a network of churches, and you will be a part of a 3-month cohort that at the end of 3 months, you will be ready to launch your own virtual reality church, with the handles of being able to determine for yourself which platforms, of all the different platforms that we've talked about so far on this show, whether that's Rec Room, VR Chat, Spatial, Big Screen, whatever, that you would have enough handles to say, I'm ready to go and plant a church in one of these spaces, with the hopes that you would then come back as a network church, and then we all share resources with each other in order to continue to advance God's kingdom all around the world through just a simple idea of a headset and through virtual reality. So that's what we're presenting, is a 3-month training process that leads to launch. If you're a church and you want to launch a multi-site campus in virtual reality in the way that we did at Lakeland VR, we will give you the tools and the handles how to do that. And then again, if you're an individual that you want to plant your own VR church in the metaverse, you come and be a part of the cohort, and we will give you the tools and handles in order to do that as well. Again, 200 million people with only a handful of churches right now. There's just so much opportunity. What you have heard through this podcast is like what Goose and Cornerstone is doing is completely different than what we're doing at Lakeland VR. And we've got tons of other friends who are doing church ministry in virtual reality right now that they do it completely different than any of us. And every single one of us is, we are attracting different pockets of individuals, and we're getting the opportunity to introduce people to Jesus for the very first time in these spaces because they are attracted to the different model styles that we're doing. And I think that's the beauty of what the metaverse provides us as church leaders, is the opportunity to work together and say, hey, you may not do it our way. And somebody shows up to your church service in VR and they go, I don't know if I necessarily vibe with this. And you can say, dude, that's totally great. Like, if you don't like what we're doing, you might like what they're doing over at Oasis or at Cornerstone or at VR Church MMO. And we can usher people in those directions, because ultimately the goal is that lost people get found and kingdom territory is won. So we're just excited. I'm excited over this idea of a VR church planting network, just because, man, the idea of 100 churches planted in virtual reality in the next 10 years is going to cause massive ripples around the world when it comes to attacking the gates of hell and winning kingdom territory. So if this excites you at all, and you want to know more about what all this looks like, let me encourage you. You can reach out to me specifically through any of our handles that will be in the show notes. So whether that's hopping over to our Discord or emailing me at the Metaverse Church Podcast at gmail.com, or you can email me at my Lakeland email, which would be stewart@lakeland.church. And just let me know, like, hey, are you like what you're interested in, just learning more about the VR church planning, saying, hey, I want to hop into one of these cohorts, whatever it is, let me know how I can best assist you in this, because this is the one thing that I have seen in the past, I guess, almost 2 months now, is that there is a lot of interest from individuals and from churches in hopping into the metaverse. And I love that. I love the fact that there are people who are seeing the need for the church to be in the metaverse. But the biggest hurdle that a lot of them are getting caught up on is they just don't know how. And that's kind of the fun part of discipleship and being a pioneer, is somebody's got to be the one who takes the first step in order to look back and give a helping hand to the person behind to say, hey, this is how we do it. Come along and do it with me. And please hear my heartbeat in this. Goose and I have talked about this before. You know, the idea of planting 100 churches in 10 years is an amazing concept in and of itself. But I think what's most amazing is somebody's going to hear the idea of this, and they're going to know that they have the green light to do this with a network of churches to support them in the process. And what is absolutely amazing about that is they're going to do it better than I ever will. And I'm totally okay with that. Like, I'm totally okay with somebody who is super passionate about leading a church in virtual reality doing a way better job than I ever will, because as long as they're reaching people for the kingdom, I'm just happy that they're there. And I'm just happy that there has been a road paved in order to give somebody like that the opportunity to step into a God-given passion, which is reaching the lost through the metaverse. So again, I hope you hear my excitement in this. This is a short episode for us on this Metaverse Church podcast. But again, if you are interested in this as an individual that wants to learn more about planning a church in virtual reality, or you are a church leader, a senior pastor of a church, or associate pastor, whatever, and you want to know more about bringing VR into your church, or I guess the vice versa, that bringing your church into VR, please hit me up on any of those handles that will be in the show notes. And I would love to have a further conversation with you about that. This VR Church Planning Network is alive and active right now. We're ready to launch our first cohort. So let this be your official invitation to join us on doing something really amazing by advancing God's kingdom all over the world through the metaverse. I hope to see you there, and we will see you next week for another episode of the Metaverse Church podcast. Be blessed.